Is that still on?
Yeah, I was going to turn it off. Do you want it on or off?
No, I want it on. Thank you. Let me start with, I have no idea why I said yes to Trish when she invited me to speak at this conference. I do not speak in public. Now stop right there. When I was in year 8 in 1969, we had 6 super smart girls in our class. And so I very quickly learnt not to ask any questions in case I looked stupid, and to try and avoid answering questions for exactly the same reason. I carried that paradigm around with me that I couldn't talk in front of people for decades. Do you know what changed that? About 15 years ago, Dad said you can get away with a lot when you've got silver hair. And as you can see, I've got silver hair, but that worried me because Dad was silver, completely silver at 35. And I thought, I wonder what Dad's tried to get away with. But that actually made me think, if I've got something that I think's worth saying, why should I be frightened? And particularly if it's my story, I'm not likely to get it wrong. And so I dropped that silly old paradigm that was doing me no good. So basically, that's how I used to feel about speaking in front of people. And then I realised that I actually had a choice. So dropped that and moved on. Just recently I was working at the Royal Adelaide show for 9 days, and I have type 1 diabetes, so I wear an insulin pump. Probably on about day 6, I noticed, no, it must have been day 7, I was wandering around the showgrounds. I was having to take some stuff from one end to the other, and I could hear this weird beeping noise, and I didn't take any notice of it because there's so many noises at the showgrounds. I just assumed it was part of something that was going on. And then I was in an old building where I had to speak to someone, and I realised that I was the beeping noise. And it was my pump. I had a look at the pump, and the screen was completely blank, and the beeping noise was something that I've never heard. And I've used this pump for probably close to 20 years. So I just made the assumption that the battery was flat. So I went and changed the battery, and then it was all fine. And about an hour and a half later, it started again. Same deal, same blank screen. Normally when the battery's flat, it makes a different noise and it comes up with a black screen. This was a dark grey, like a weird grey. Anyway, so I changed the battery again, and blow me down, same thing happened. So I disconnected my pump, and for the rest of the day, anytime I wanted to have something to eat, I had to have an injection instead of the pump delivering insulin when I told it to. When I got home, I reconnected my pump with a new battery, so we're up to about battery number 3. Duracell and I are very good friends, because that's the only type you can use in this pump. It's a bit fussy. And for the next 14 hours, while I was at home, the pump was absolutely fine. But in the meantime, I'd looked up my pump failure information so that I knew what to do if it did go really haywire. Blow me down, within an hour of getting to the show the next day, same thing happened. So I rang my husband, said, can you bring back down this particular injection of long-acting insulin and take my pump home? So I'm assuming that I'm going to have to ring the specialist, and it was on a weekend. I thought, oh, goodness me, what am I going to do? And I thought, no, I do have an emergency backup plan. It will be all right, and whatever. I got through it. Prior to learning any mindset stuff, and I particularly enjoyed your presentation this morning, Lucy, because I'm right into what we allow into our minds and out of our mouths and how that affects us. But prior to learning any mindset stuff, I'd have gone into a total pink funk over something like that happening. Just about a nervous breakdown. And I thought, well, actually, in the scheme of things, I'm going to be all right. I've got a plan B. So I did realise that I had a choice. It's a very long story, wasn't it? And I also realised that I could choose to be grateful. Grateful for medical technology. Grateful that we've got insulin pumps. It's not nearly as primitive as it used to be years ago, so we've made huge advances. So rather than being grumpy about it, I thought, well, I can be grateful about it. Now today I'm going to tell you 3 stories about people who've had life-changing experiences, and they've got attitude. They've got a really good attitude. So let's get into it. If you come back with me to 1974, Mum and Dad went on their first holiday without us kids. My sister was 20, so she was old enough to look after us. And actually I'm going to need a chair in a minute. So they went on a caravanning holiday in New South Wales. Anybody here been to Dubbo? Right, every audience I ever speak to, someone's been to Dubbo, but I haven't. So you correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm told it's on this vast, expansive flat plain with a highway that just keeps going forever, the Newell Highway. So Mum and Dad were travelling back towards Dubbo. I was at home alone on a Tuesday night and there was a knock at the wooden front door. When I opened the door, my eyes met those of a man who I knew really well. He was the minister from our church. Now this was 7:30 on a Tuesday night and my heart took a leap because I knew that wasn't a regular time for him to be visiting. Anyway, I invited him in, we went in and sat down and he said, "Gail, I've had a phone call from your dad. Mum and Dad have had a really serious car accident. They're okay, sort of. Your mum's in the Dubbo Base Hospital with serious but not life-threatening injuries." So what happened, they were heading towards Dubbo and there's a bridge just out of Dubbo, Tomingley Bridge. As they approached that, there was this huge jolt from behind. A refrigerated semi-trailer caught 1.5 inches of the top back corner of the caravan, which jackknifed the car and caravan, so the caravan went head over wheels into the creek bed that way. The car flung around and smashed into the concrete pylon at the start of the bridge, and the engine from the dashboard forward went down into the creek bed that way. And Mum said if you'd been sitting in her seat as they were flung along the bridge, all the white concrete posts looked like a picket fence. That's how fast they were going. And they ended up somewhere way down the road. Now, fortunately, they were wearing seatbelts, which in 1974 weren't compulsory. But every time they went outside the metropolitan area, they always wore them. I'm really grateful that they did, because that's what their car looked like. The police had no idea how anybody could possibly have got out of that. So when they stopped, Mum, who was always as cool as a cucumber, I don't think I ever saw Mum get angry in her whole life. She was just very calm. Her door was missing. She looked down, she said, "My leg's missing, can you run back to the caravan and get a towel to make a tourniquet?" So she spent some time in Dubbo Base Hospital and then was airlifted back to the Royal Adelaide to finish recovering. And then she came home and she had to have an artificial leg made. Now, you know what it's like when you're watching little kids learn to walk? You know, they're walking along and then sometimes they stumble and sometimes they fall and sometimes you catch them. Imagine how nerve-wracking it is watching your mum learn to walk and having some of those falls. Yet Mum never, ever, ever complained. She just got on with being grateful for what she could still do. There were only 2 things that she couldn't do. And you'll probably laugh when I tell you one of them. One of them was to kneel down to do the weeding. Now, tragic as it may sound, Mum loved weeding. And she couldn't ride a bike anymore. But she got on with using swimming as an exercise. Mum and Dad, I reckon it was about just a few years before, Mum and Dad had put in a swimming pool, so Mum made a habit of using that as her exercise. Now, on that stretch of road, it's so dead straight, lots of drivers fall asleep. And that's actually why the accident happened. The semi-trailer driver fell asleep. So the local Rotarians have formed a group called the Highway Samaritans. Sorry, I just have to start something here if I can. Because so many people need help along that stretch of road. And they really were Mum and Dad's Good Samaritans. They gave Dad accommodation, took him backwards and forwards to the hospital to visit Mum, took care of all the belongings. Once the police had finished with this wreckage, they took it back to a wrecking yard and looked after their personal belongings. And some of them became lifelong friends. They were absolutely amazing. So that's a brilliant service, and I think it might still be provided in that stretch of road. So the Rotarians are doing an awesome job to make sure that everyone is looked after. Yeah. This was the article in the newspaper the next day. And is there anyone here from the media? I probably should be careful about saying this. Honestly, reporting facts accurately is really interesting. In there it calls my dad Edward Doble, and he saw the journalist write down William Keith Doble. So he's not quite sure how Edward appeared in there, but there he is, married to my mum. And there were 2 or 3 other facts that were in there that were wrong, and Dad said, I watched him write it. How did that? Anyway, that's a little aside. Mum said to me, I should have died in that accident, but I didn't. I guess God isn't finished with me yet. So she firmly believed that she was here for a reason. Now, when you've got an artificial leg or arm or any artificial external part, they don't fit forever, because as your stump changes, it's either going to get too tight or too sloppy. So one year when Mum and Dad were having a hard rubbish collection, Dad came up from the shed with an artificial leg under each arm. And he asked, can we get rid of these? And Mum said, of course we can. They're of no use to anyone else. But don't just drop them on the footpath with the other rubbish. Why don't you droop them over the old television? So when the rubbish guys arrived, this is what they saw. And it seriously looked like there was a dead body drooped over the television. Dad just happened to see them arrive, and they jumped out of their truck. And this is back in the days of the old tip trucks, with the flap at the back and whatever. They jumped out of the truck and then kind of stopped dead in their tracks because they really did think it was a dead body. So when they realised it was just artificial limbs, they put all the rest of the rubbish in the truck, but not the legs. They drew one over the tailgate on that side and one over the tailgate on that side. And off they went with a grin on their face. So they were going to enjoy the reactions of people on their round. This is another little aside. We had this tiny little Scottish lady who lived next door to us. And she came in and she tore strips off Dad. How could you dare mock Barbara like that, putting those legs over the television? And Mum said, hang on a minute, Anne, it was my idea. So Mum never took herself too seriously, which was great. Mum had to have her entire aorta replaced when she was 74 with stents because she'd had an aortic aneurysm but survived it and whatever. And at the end of the operation, she was paralysed. It's the known risk. There's 3% of people who have this operation. Like, it's your entire aorta. It takes 13 hours. They drain spinal fluid to do it, so it's dodgy. But it was either that or risk it blowing out and just dropping dead on the spot. So she thought she'd take the risk. Still, she didn't complain. She just got on with some rehabilitation at Hampstead Rehab Hospital, learning how to propel herself around in a wheelchair and going to a nursing home. And she just got on with life. She was really, really grateful. She said, look, I should have died in the accident and I didn't. I could have died when I had the aortic aneurysm and I didn't. And then she had an aortic root replacement and that's dodgy too, didn't die in that. And she said, I don't know why I'm still here. I'm of no use. It's really sad when you hear your mum say that. And I said, hang on a minute, you think about it. You've been in the nursing home for some time now. I said, do you think about the number of carers that come in? They've got their cup of coffee. Officially, they're meant to be having a tea break, but they never get one. And they'll be tending to mum and spilling the beans on what's going on in their lives. Stuff that they've got to get out of their system, but in a lot of cases, their mums were home in Africa, India, the Philippines, Iran, and she actually became their mum. Quite a few of them called her mum because she was always so interested in them. And I said, you are a really good listener, and that is a skill and a gift. So I said, please don't underestimate you. That's why you're still here. So we've all got a gift of some sort, whether we've got limitations or not. A couple of my friends said, oh, you poor thing, fancy having diabetes. I said, hang on a minute, my brother's celiac. That's way more difficult to manage than my condition. So, you know, but anyway, we've all got a gift. It's just a matter of finding out what that is and using it. Now, does anyone know what a rack is? No? It's a random act of kindness. That is a gift. Lucy actually touched on this morning. I was madly writing this down, thinking, oh my goodness, I know this. When we give an act of kindness to someone, they get a hit of serotonin, which is a feel-good hormone. But inadvertently, the byproduct is so do we. So suddenly you've got these lots of feel-good hormones floating around out there. Now you imagine if everyone on the planet did one rack every day. How much feel-good energy would we have blasting around the world? I just think that one's worth thinking about. Eventually, I decided to write a book. Back when Mum was walking with an artificial limb, I took her to the Royal Adelaide show one day in a wheelchair because she couldn't walk long distances, and I sat in the wheelchair for a rest because it was hard work pushing her around. Like, the showgrounds are huge and they've got these lovely brick drains that go like that, and it's down and up and down and up and whatever. So at the handicraft section, Mum hopped out to have a look at the exhibits and I sat in the wheelchair for a rest. And I was totally gobsmacked at how people treated me. And in fact, somebody yesterday that I was talking to when I first arrived was talking about how, can I use you as an example? Hello dear, how are you? Anybody ever experienced that? Or people shout at you like you're totally deaf because you're in a wheelchair, and of course that, you know, that's going to cause a problem. Or they talk to me like a 2-year-old. And when I was telling Mum this, when she hopped back in the wheelchair and we got going, she said, happens all the time. People treat me like I'm a regular person when I'm walking and like I'm mentally not connected as soon as I'm in the wheelchair. I thought, this is just wrong. So that idea was kind of lurking in my head for years. I thought children need to be educated from an early age to know that that's not the way to treat people. So the idea was in my head for years, and then when Mum was paralysed, I decided to interview some people who use wheelchairs and write a book for school children. And so What We're Really Like was born. I marketed it to schools, and the only way to do that was to drive around to 300 metropolitan schools in Adelaide, because every school on the planet, unfortunately, is responsible for choosing their own resources. I rang every regional office in Australia, there's 65 of them, and they all told me the same thing, no, we won't advertise it. Rang the International Baccalaureate Board in Singapore, and I contacted someone in London and got the same response. So I just drove around and started leaving it at schools, and 1 in 2.3 schools bought something because their resources were from the 1960s. Like, they showed me pictures of these books they were using, you know, boys with little basin haircuts and, you know, their shirts buttoned up to their neck. And I thought, good grief. Anyway, so that book's out there, trying to help children to understand that we all deserve to be treated with love, care, dignity and respect, whether we've got bright green hair or whether we get around in a wheelchair or, you know, speak with a funny accent or whatever. So that's how that book was born. The second story I'm going to tell you is our story. I had no idea how much I was going to need Mum's press-on regardless spirit. In June 1980, I was pregnant with our first baby, 33 and a half weeks, and things started to go wrong. So I ended up in hospital, and they gave me some injections to mature our baby's lungs quickly. They put me on some medication to try and stop me going into labour and whatever. And then Mum said something to me that was really odd. She said, if you have to have this baby early, it's got to be born between 7 and 7:30 p.m. on the 1st of July. Now, if you know anything about pregnant women or anything about babies, you know that they've all got a mind of their own. So there's no point trying to tell them what they have to do. My background's in children's dentistry, and after my neck and my elbow wouldn't let me sit and drill and fill anymore after 20 years, I worked for obstetricians, and I know that as fast as you can plan an induction or a caesarean, the woman will go off and do something, of her own. But like a dutiful daughter, our first baby, Luke, was born right on the dot of 7:30 on the 1st of July. Now, why do you think Mum made such a silly request? Mum had 3 babies and we were all born between 7 and 7:30 p.m, none of this 3 o'clock in the morning nonsense. And if my grandma was still alive, she would have been 90 on the 1st of July 1980. So that was a significant day to her. Anyway, so Luke was 6.5 weeks early and he was absolutely fine when he was born. But if you know anything about prem babies, they'd rather be in here where it's warm and cosy and they don't have to do anything. And so you actually have to wake them up to feed them. So during the night, a nurse would come in and wake Luke up and wake me up and I'd feed him. When he was 3 days old, the nurse woke me up and she said, "Luke's really cold. I'm going to take him down to the nursery to warm him up and we'll feed him down there, so you just go back to sleep and he'll be back by the time you wake up." When I woke up, I looked over to where his cot should have been and he wasn't there. I had no idea what that meant. And shortly after, the obstetrician came to see me and his first question was, "What time's Ron coming to see you today?" I knew that wasn't a good question. I said, "He can't come till about 9 o'clock tonight." And he said, "That's fine. I'll come and see you both then. But in the meantime, Luke needs to stay in the neonatal unit." Now, I've just told you my background is in dentistry. And if I'm on the other end of a high-speed drill or a drill removing a nerve or lancing an abscess or creating a great big mess, I'm absolutely fine. But I do not watch medical programs because I can't watch a scalpel going through anything. So I'm a bit squeamish when I'm seeing it rather than inflicting it. Because I'd only been to one antenatal class because I'd had Luke so early, I hadn't been on the tour of the neonatal unit. And nobody thought to tell me that if you can't find a decent vein in a baby's foot or their hand, there's a fabulous one right in the middle of their forehead. So I walked in and there's Luke with a drip in his head. And I thought I was going to pass out. It was awful. When the doctor came to see us that night, he said, "Luke's picked up a hospital infection. He's a very, very sick boy. We've got him on heavy-duty antibiotics, but we don't know if they're going to work. We'll need at least 24 hours to see what happens." So here we were hit with what I now call anticipatory grief, all the what ifs. What if he dies? What if he lives and there's something seriously wrong? As it turned out, he was absolutely fine. He's now 6'3", big broad shoulders, spent 23 years as an aircraft engineer. So his rocky start didn't hold him back. When Luke was 2.5, I was pregnant again. And they'd done all sorts of tests and couldn't work out why I'd had Luke early. So it was going to be a seemingly normal pregnancy. We were away in Melbourne for a weekend. Ron and my father and Luke were going to go to a car race and Mum and I were just going to poke around and do something. And on the Sunday morning, they'd gone off to the racetrack, and this is before mobile phones, so we had no way of contacting them. And I worked out that I was having contractions, and then I said to Mum, "They're 5 minutes apart, you better get an ambulance." And so, you know what Melbourne's like with all these tram tracks crisscrossing? You lay in an ambulance, desperately trying not to go into labour and bump over all these tram tracks. And it was not, I can laugh about it now, but it wasn't jolly funny at the time. Anyway, so I ended up in hospital. They put me on a drip and managed to stall things for 13 hours. And then in the middle of the night, our next baby, Katie, was born. And she only lived for just over an hour. She was too young to survive back then. And in fact, they told me that the only place where a prem baby might have survived back then was Flinders Medical Centre, which was just down the road from us had we been home. But anyway, so here we were hit with real grief. Now, quite often, if you have a miscarriage, stillbirth, or a baby that dies shortly after birth, People don't know what to do, so they basically ignore it, pretend it didn't happen. And that's what my in-laws' side of the family did. With the exception of one person, nobody has ever mentioned it. Fortunately, my family and my husband and whatever, were a bit more willing to talk about things. But does anybody here have someone that they would call a kindred spirit? Somebody that the minute you know them, you feel like you've known them forever? Yeah, quite a few people know someone like that. I was like that with Ron's Auntie Marge. She was just amazing. We could talk about anything and everything. She came to me one day and she asked me, how are you going to deal with losing Katie? Now, firstly, I was thrilled to bits that someone acknowledged that I'd even had a baby, and secondly, that she used her name. It was fabulous. And I said, well, I think I've got three choices. I can drive off Old Belair Road. Now, is anyone here, Lucy's, yeah, we've got a few Adelaideans here. Okay, for those of you that know Old Belair Road, it's windy and it's about a 500 metre drop, and there is no way you would survive driving off there. I said, I'm not going to do that.
Windy Point.
Yep, yeah, it's exactly the same as Windy Point for those of you who don't live in Adelaide but have been to Adelaide. It's a very serious drop. I said, I'm not going to do that. I can sit around and get mopey and miserable and depressed. I've never done that before and I don't want to do that now. Or I can figure out how to get through it. And in time, that's what Ron and I did. When Luke was 4.5, I was pregnant again. So getting pregnant's not my problem, staying pregnant's the problem. And I got to 25 weeks and they'd done a surgical procedure to stop me having a prem baby, and I still went into labour. So I ended up back in hospital, and it was 5 weeks before I had the next baby, but in that 5 weeks, I kept meeting people who I thought their situation was way worse than mine. So I started being really grateful for the fact that we didn't lose our first baby. At least when we had Katie, I had Luke to go home to, and I was too busy looking after him to stay wallowing in a horrible pit, where other people didn't have that situation. So I started to feel sorry for them. Anyway, Catherine was born 10.5 weeks early, and she did extremely well, survived all the prem baby stuff, and caught up on everything by the time she was 2, although the doctor said she'd do that by the time she was 5. So she was in a hurry to catch up. And anyone here know the story of Pollyanna? It's a very old-fashioned story, but it's about this little girl who lived in a town called Harrington, and she just was insistent that everybody had to be happy. And there were some really grumpy old people in that town, and she used to play the glad game, trying to cheer people up. And Catherine reminded me of Pollyanna, because she just wanted everybody to be happy. And I remember one day Dad was laying on his bed feeling downright miserable, and Catherine climbed up next to him and gave him a peck on the cheek and said, "Does that make you feel better, Grandpa?" And her attitude and her nature did. In July 1989, we went to Second Valley. Anyone here been to Second Valley? Yep. It actually won the seaside town of Australia several years ago. It's this really quaint, tiny little horseshoe beach with some rocky cliffs and whatever. It's a lovely place. My in-laws have a shack there. And so we went to Second Valley for a weekend, and then Luke and I had to go back to school and work, and I dropped Ron and Catherine at his parents' place at Wollonga, which is near the McLaren Vale wine region, on the way back. And we'd had a fabulous time. Because it was winter and the waves were, tossing and carrying on, there was foam everywhere, and Catherine insisted that it was the wobbly foam. And they were squelching around in their gumboots in lots of seaweed, and it was fabulous. So I dropped them off, and then on the 19th of July at 2 a.m, I woke up. At 2 a.m, my sister woke up. And at 2 a.m, my best friend woke up, and of course we all went back to sleep. At 4:30, there was a knock at the wooden front door. And I opened the door to everyone's worst nightmare. It was the police. and Ron. They came in and we sat down in the lounge room. The fire had gone out from the night before, it was cold. They said, "We're sorry to inform you that Catherine was pronounced dead at Noarlunga Hospital at 2 a.m. I have attempted to do this without the tears, but when I actually cried the first time while I was doing this, I had half the audience that I could see was resonating, because everyone has a story. So the 2 a.m, I believe that people who care about each other are energetically connected. So my sister, my best friend and I, because of that interconnected energy, all woke up at 2 a.m, which is right when, whoop, is there a... We'll just, no, maybe we're not going to do it with a microphone. Okay, I've got a big voice too. So Catherine was 4.5 years old when she died and didn't wake up. She died of a sleep apnea condition that only adults die of. Now, interestingly, one of the talks this morning, they said that they're doing, more research into children and sleep apnea and whatever. Back then, in 1989, sleep apnea research was just in its infancy. And so this now made sense of a whole lot of breathing issues that Catherine had had during her life that doctors could never piece together. But after the rawness of her death started to ease, I started to be really grateful for the way she died. She didn't die of some ghastly disease and fade away before our eyes at the Women's and Children's Hospital. She wasn't raped and murdered, and there were a number of girls around that time who had been. Thank you. Thanks. She wasn't abducted. We'd had several abductions in South Australia at that time, and they're still unsolved. So none of those horrible things happened. So we only have happy memories of a little girl who went to bed perfectly healthy and didn't wake up. And in the scheme of things, I think if you have to lose a child, what an awesome way for that to happen. So whilst it's a sad story, even in that, I found something to be grateful for. And I'm also eternally grateful for a husband who continued to talk so that we could actually share how we were feeling. Lots of people, one or the other, will clam up, and it can ruin marriages. In fact, in 95% of cases, apparently it does. But we've managed to survive all that. So we've been married for just over 45 years, and we're both still happy with that arrangement. It's good. Now, people who didn't live through that part of our lives with us, firstly can't understand that Ron and I are still married, and secondly can't understand how we can possibly be happy. They said, you need to write about it and let people know that you can get through tough stuff. I was talking before about mum's press on regardless spirit. I'm so glad I had a mum like that, because I adopted some of that. So eventually I wrote Unscrambling Grief. So it's our story of how we got through that journey. And I particularly love the cover. I told the graphic designer I wanted to start down here in a cold, lonely place, go on a slow trudging journey and end up over there in the light. And that's what she came up with. And what she didn't know is if you superimpose two photos that Ron and I took in Europe in winter one year, one was of me walking on a snowy path, and he took a photo of the footprints in the snow, and we caught a train from Zurich up to a little mountain called Uettelberg. And because it was Christmas time, all the snow was on the trees. You put those two photos together and that's what you've got. I thought that was amazing, but that described our journey. There's no quick way through it. There's no shortcuts. But sometime on that journey, there is a little bit of light if you choose to see it. And gradually the light gets more and more until one day you find you're out in the light all the time. And that's how it was for us. Now, Anthony Robbins, anyone here know Anthony Robbins? He's a mindset guru and author and whatever, and you know, talks about how we can transform our minds. Excuse me. He talks about the fact that we can't move on from pain unless we replace it with pleasure. Just excuse me. For us, that was the hope that we might be able to have another baby. Now, we knew that if we had another baby, it was going to be long, traumatic, tricky pregnancy, but we'd got the okay from the obstetrician and the okay from my diabetes specialist, because by that stage I had type 1 diabetes. And so we went ahead and had another baby. I was laying down from 16 weeks, booked to go into hospital at 25 weeks because that's when I'd come unstuck, but instead I went into labour at 24 and a half weeks. I'm just a right old court case when it comes to having babies properly. So the doctor said, right, grab your suitcase, you're going into hospital and you'll stay there till the baby's born. And eventually things managed to settle down and I got to 36 weeks and it just happened to be an Olympic year, so my friend made me an Olympic gold medal on a lanyard and whatever, and a certificate for my best effort yet. So Heidi was born. She had to stay in the neonatal unit for several weeks so that they could check on her breathing because of Catherine dying of a breathing issue, and she was absolutely fine. But this is Luke, he was 12 when she was born, and he's very quiet, wants to stay in the background and not be noticed, but he had no qualms about getting a brand new little baby dressed after she'd had her bath and whatever, and the nurses said, he's way more competent than lots of first-time mums we've seen. And so he had no idea, thankfully, that they were watching. But he was so besotted with his new little sister that he said, when she comes home from hospital, can I take her as my show and tell? If I told him that now, he'd probably be mortified. But anyway, and this is the two of them as adults. So, look, I'm a firm believer that life is about attitude. As you can see, I've got silver hair, I'm in my mid-60s, and lots of my friends have either retired or they're planning to or whatever. Everybody thinks I should be slowing down. Well, I think that's a load of hogwash. I actually run a business, Aged Care Explained. I'm the missing link between confused families and where the right help can be found. So I can help families anywhere in the world with parents anywhere in Australia. And that business is just starting to grow, so I'm not starting to wind down. And just to prove that you can do whatever you want to, I decided to drive in a demolition derby last year. When I was a kid, Dad would take us to the Speedway just on demolition derby night. And we used to love it, and that's where we learnt to eat Chico rolls. Admittedly, these days I don't think I could face one. Anyway, Ron saw the demo derby advertised at Murray Bridge Speedway a couple of years ago, and I said, oh, well, let's go. And at the end of the race, he said, I said, I'd love to do that. And he said, are you serious? I said, yeah, I'm deadly serious. And Ron was a motor mechanic. He'd built a racing car before I even met him, and he worked with a team in Indianapolis in America. So he had all the know-how, and then he went on to do engineering and worked in research and development at Mitsubishi. So cars has always been his thing. So we decided to have a go. Now there's no sound, and I'm basically going to talk you through a bit of this. So this is me head to toe in a fireproof racing suit. My car belched smoke for the entire time I was running, so you could always see where I was. 2 rules. You're not allowed to deliberately drive into the driver's door, and when you're passing something, you have to try and hit it. So this is me. On the warm-up lap, they water the track, which is mud, with a water tanker 3 times, and it slopes down towards the centre, so that was fun just trying to even do the form-up lap. But in a minute, when the green light comes on, okay, I come around the top. I'll show you when. And this is the first lap, and I get hit, and I get spun around. I think that's me coming along. In a minute, a black car's going to hit me from behind. Here it comes. and then changes my direction. And while I'm still trying to figure out how to change direction again, a colourful car's about to hit me in the front and do it for me. So it was easy peasy. Meanwhile, on the other side of the track, there's kind of all this mayhem that's about to start. It is just so much fun. You've got all these safety features built in, there's no glass allowed in the car at all, and it was just a great fun thing to do. That's what the bonnet looked like. But we actually sold it to someone who drove it in the Demolition Derby this year. Now, this is my business. Don't wait till the wheels fall off and you see all the different colour paints I accumulated along the way. It was a great fun thing to do. Now, I had people saying, oh, why would you do that? What if you get hurt? I thought, well, what if I don't? You know, you've got to have a go at things. You know, don't let other people tell you what to do. And I'm guessing that I'm in a room full of people who are probably very good at not letting other people tell them what to do. You all know that life's to be lived. So I reckon, you know, attitude is everything, really. Now, our third story is about a friend of ours in Germany. His name's Simon. Our daughter went on an exchange to Germany at the end of year 11 and came back all starry-eyed. She'd met this young man, and they became an item. And Heidi and Brady, Brady's her new husband. Heidi and Simon were an item for 4.5 years, and eventually the distance got to be a problem. Neither of them wanted to move to the other one's country. And as soon as COVID hit, I was so grateful that they didn't end up together, because there was the potential that either family wouldn't have been able to see their kids for years. So, good outcome. But anyway, Simon was a supreme adventurer, just loved to do daredevil things. Shortly after we met him, he wrapped up his 200th skydive. So, you know, leaping out of high places is his thing. And he wouldn't have been any good coming to Australia anyway, because we don't have enough extreme adventure. We haven't got the types of mountains that he liked to climb. Anyway, even though they parted company, we've remained really good friends with Simon and his parents. So when we go to Germany, that's who we stay with. I got a message from Simon's mum one Tuesday morning, and in her broken English she said, "We have some not so good news about Simon, but thankfully he's still alive." So, Simon had had a base jumping accident. He jumped off a cliff in Lauterbrunnen in Switzerland, and this was in the message. And as soon as I read Karen's message, I knew where it was. It's actually this cliff that you can go inside, and it's where a glacier finishes, and there's a stunning waterfall inside the base of this mountain. Anyway, Simon jumped off there. He was the first of he and his two friends to jump that day. And as soon as he jumped, he knew, and pulled his parachute cord, he knew that the wind had changed. It flipped him around, smashed him into the cliff face, and he fell 100 metres and landed on a ledge and clung to the ledge for 2.5 hours waiting to be rescued. Now, Simon had just passed a medical to go into the German army. We've got a chin-up bar in one of our bedrooms, and he could literally do chin-ups at that speed, where I can't even get my toes off the ground at any speed. And have you ever seen anybody do a human flag, where you have a pole and Simon could do that for goodness knows how long. So he was ridiculously strong, and thankfully he was, because he had to cling to this ledge. He was laying on the ledge, not dangling from it, but even so, when you're still a couple of 100 metres up in the air, must have been terrifying. So, and they had two mobile phones between 3 people. Simon had one in his pocket and he couldn't move his hand to, use it. And one of his friends went sailing past him, then went back up to the top of the mountain and said to his friend, "Simon's dead on a ledge." The first that they knew that he wasn't was when he waved to them after they'd airlifted him up with a helicopter, and there he is cheerily waving. So this was in Switzerland. He was in a major trauma hospital there, and they took a piece of hip out and fused it into his neck. And then he was moved to a major trauma hospital in Germany a few days later. When he arrived there, he had to have a scan and whatever, and just got on with the rehabilitation and whatever that they were going to do. But after a few days, the staff started asking around if anybody knew what drugs this guy was on, because they'd never met anybody who'd had such a horrendous accident and been told that you've got quadriplegia, who could possibly be cheery. And Simon was 23 at the time. Then when they finally tracked down his drug chart, they discovered he wasn't on anything. No painkillers and no medications of any type. So a few months later, we were in Germany visiting, and Simon and his dad were picking us up from the airport, and I expected Simon to sort of wheel himself in a wheelchair and blow me down. We were just walking out as we were expecting them to walk in. He hopped out of the car and stood up. A week after they strapped him into a robotic walking machine, his brain started telling his legs what to do. So although he has no feeling from there down, he can walk. Quite extraordinary. So of course I dissolved into a puddle of tears. I used to say to Heidi, if you don't marry Simon, we're going to adopt him. And we still feel like that. And actually, Heidi got married last year to the Australian version of Simon. It's so freaky. And even the guys, because they've met each other and they're really good friends, even the guys think that. They kind of look at each other like, this is weird. Did you really say that? They think so much alike, their facial expressions, and they're amazing. So Simon's just got on with figuring out what he can do, rather than obsessing about what he can't do. He's just worked out not so long ago that he can get himself in and out of a kayak because he's still got his amazing upper body strength, and so he just gets on with it. But we were sitting on a train on the way back from Munich one day, and the rest of our group was kind of over there, and it was just Simon and I. And I asked him, do you mind me asking about what happened in your accident? He said, no, of course you can. He said, I'll tell you. So when I got flipped around, because my parachute was going the wrong way, and my neck hit the cliff face, he said it completely smashed my 5, 6 and 7 to pieces. And he got really, really excited, and I thought, well, this is really odd, I mean, who says completely smashed 5, 6 and 7 and I'm excited about it? He said, do you know the cool thing about that? The doctors told me that if I'd fractured a vertebrae, I would have severed my own spinal cord, and then I'd only be able to move my eyes. So he said, how cool is that? There was nothing to cut my spinal cord. What an extraordinary reaction. But that's the way Simon responds to life. He just looks at the positive. I found that quite extraordinary. Now, dear Simon met this young lady. She was the sonographer that had to do the scan of him at the major trauma hospital in Murnau, which is near his village. So Susie kind of quite liked this guy, and so she decided that she'd go home via his village one day, which was only an hour out of her way, but she did it anyway. And they decided to have coffee and eventually fell in love, and they got married not so long ago. It's a lovely outcome to the story. Had Simon not had his accident, he probably would never have met Susie. And that's the way both of them view it. So life is however we look at it. If we choose to have an attitude of gratitude, it will take us in a completely different direction. So I'm a firm believer that attitude is everything, and that you all have gifts to offer this world. So please, just be you. Thank you.